What we're going to be discussing today is looking at one of the bigger and trickier challenges that faces green sectors, which is around the production capacity of the ecosystem, looking at crew, infrastructure services, and how to best support long-term sustainable growth. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about a service that we have at Oldsberg SPI, the Production Infrastructure and Capacity Analysis, or PICA. Then looking at some key findings from a recent study that we did with Screen Australia. And then Grainne will join me for discussion, and then we'll have a Q&A. This webinar is about 45 minutes. You can add questions at any time using the Q&A function in Zoom. We will endeavour to answer as many of them as possible, but if we don't get a chance to answer your question, please do reach out by email and we can continue the conversation offline. So just as a little bit of background about Oldsberg SPI, we're an international creative industries consulting firm based in London, but we work globally. And we work across a lot of industry development projects, looking at sector development strategies, economic impact assessments of incentives or other programs, workforce and skills development reports, and a number of others. And we work with film commissions, film offices, governments, as well as private clients globally. So as a little bit of context and background before we go into the capacity discussion, as I'm sure most of you will be aware, the screen sector is really increasingly being regarded by governments not only as culturally important, which it absolutely is and has always been, but also as a powerful driver for economic development in terms of jobs, in terms of supporting not only the screen sector, but other business sectors in a market, and creating things like screen tourism opportunities. So leading up to the pandemic, we saw rapid growth in production numbers and also the value of that production that was taking place. And we also saw production shifting more globally. So still in those major production hubs that historically we've always known about, but also starting to work globally in new cities or new countries, sometimes because of new incentives or programs that attracted them, but also to have new locations, new visions on screen for audiences. And this growth put a really significant demand on skilled workforce and infrastructure, especially in some of those newer sectors where they may have had a domestic sector but hadn't had the same volume or level of production previously. And that resulted in a lot of new training programs, studio developments, and other policies to try and meet those capacity challenges. However, these are all things that take time to develop. And unfortunately, some of the long-term consequences we've seen for some of these more short-term approaches to planning is that those programs addressed direct needs in terms of some of the roles, but didn't necessarily look at how to retain and sustainably develop that workforce and the production sector in that location. Which leads us to the Production Infrastructure Capacity Analysis, or PICA, that we do at Oldsberg SPI. So this is a bespoke analysis looking specifically at capacity constraints and opportunities for a jurisdiction, providing data so that someone can better understand the shape and scale of the workforce, including where gaps exist and why those gaps exist. And this can then support decision-making on funding or initiatives that can support and strengthen the program, but also just identify some of those wider structural or cultural challenges that can lead to attrition or burnout, or just hamper the growth of that particular jurisdiction. And these are a bespoke study We always work closely with our clients to work out what the specific needs and objectives may be, but underpinning all of that is a consistent methodology, one where we we produce an assessment of the below the line workforce, the services and infrastructure in that market, which could be a city, it could be a region, it could be a country. And we do an assessment of at least 80 production components. When we get onto the Screen Australia study, we actually had 670 roles, facilities, services that we looked at in Australia in terms of capacity. We also look at the roles and skill gaps, so to really understand not only what the capacity is, but also why those gaps maybe are there and how they can be strategically addressed to fill and strengthen the role and the skill. And then we always have a component of sector growth, looking at how the industry can grow sustainably, can increase future economic and strategic impacts, and benefit everyone that's working in it. And we have a range of methodologies that we use for this. So I won't go into all of these, but we do speak to a huge number of people in different formats. So we do one-on-one consultations, we'll do focus groups so we can dig deeper into the findings that we have coming out, but also to really understanding why some of those capacity constraints exist, but also where opportunities maybe could arise for developing the sector more strategically in the future. And then most importantly is the online survey. This is something we'll have in each one of our PICA studies, and it's how we gather the quantitative data we need to be able to map the capacity in that jurisdiction, but also it's a way for us to gain a lot of qualitative insight. So understanding the education pathway people took into the sector, what sort of upskilling they're doing once they are working in a role, what their goals are personally in terms of where they're aspiring to move to in the industry, as well as more geographic questions. Do they live where they work? Do they have to travel? And things like that. So this leads us to the Screen Australia PICA study that we published a couple of months ago. So we partnered with Screen Australia for this work. This actually builds on a study we did in 2021 for Ausfilm. However, the Ausfilm study specifically focused on capacity for inward productions in Australia. This time we were looking at inward and domestic production, both in terms of physical production that was happening on the ground, PDV and animation. So that's looking at post-production, VFX, animation, and then also digital games as a new area of analysis. We also looked at education and training provision in Australia, infrastructure and services. And this was ultimately a national piece, but we did, where we had the data available, provide state and territory breakdowns, and we did endeavour to speak to as many people as we could from all 7 states and territories in Australia. And as you can see, we spoke to over 150 people working across within the industry, but also across training, policy making. A lot of these took place in person, but also doing online consultations so that we could speak to people who were based regionally or who weren't able to join us in person. A number of focus groups, and then 3 online surveys. So 1 for each of those separate sector groups. And our main goal was just to make sure that we had a really comprehensive data set and evidence base that could be used going forward by Screen Australia, by the state film offices, and all of the other industry, education, policymaking stakeholders to develop initiatives, to understand their sector, and to be able to collaborate and work together to build the sector in the future. So because we have Grainne joining us today, I'm not going to go too deep into too many different parts of the report, but I wanted to provide some snapshot analysis in terms of what we covered and what we found. So looking at a couple of roles and some of the key findings that came across the work. So one of the roles that came up as having quite low capacity and some real challenges around it was the line producer in physical production. So just to explain the ranking, when we did the survey, we asked everyone to score each role in terms of 0, which means that the role doesn't exist. 1, it exists, but there's low availability. 2, it exists and it's moderate in terms of availability. And 3, it exists with high availability. So as you can see, we had a national ranking, a weighted average of 1.48, so quite low availability. And when you look at the state and territory breakdown, that fluctuates a bit. The more established production hubs on the East Coast has slightly higher and then lower elsewhere. But a few things we found about the line producer that contributed to this score. So it's a very specialized role. It also takes time to progress, to have the experience and the knowledge to be able to fulfill the role of a line producer. So even if a program was initiated maybe 2 or 3 or even 4 years ago, you're not necessarily seeing people at the stage of being a line producer yet. They're going to take time to build the necessary skills so that they can do that role effectively. One thing we also did find was that during the post-pandemic boom, there was premature progression and promotions for people who were maybe moved up from mid-career roles into the line producer role too soon, when they were still underprepared, and didn't necessarily understand all the nuances of that particular role and had certain gaps in their skill set. Could be around some of the budgeting components. It could be to do with communication across a production. This can obviously increase production risk, but also it puts a lot of pressure on that line producer that's been promoted prematurely and doesn't have that skill set that they need, and may result in them feeling really underprepared, overexposed, and lead to attrition for them. And just in general, we heard that this was a role that faced a lot of burnout and attrition, really long hours. It's a very high pressure role. There is a huge amount of knowledge needed in terms of across the production. So we heard that experienced professionals at the line producer level were either leaving the sector or were moving into other roles, which maybe they felt they had a better work-life balance. And then as a example from the digital games sector, we have the gameplay programmer, which had a healthier national capacity ranking. This one, even though the capacity wasn't too bad, people did raise a couple of concerns, mostly that this is a very technical role, so it does require a lot of training, a lot of experience. The people best suited to this role are very adaptable, so they need to have versatile skills across different languages, different games engines, particularly where the video game sector is at the moment, and the importance of having agility and responsiveness within a studio. So it's a really valuable role. And because it's so valuable and because they're so adaptable, they're also incredibly attractive to other sectors. So particularly fintech came up a lot, but also mining and even education. And sometimes these industries can offer higher paying salaries, but also more secure roles. So if people are looking at starting a family or just want to be able to have a work-life balance that's sort of a more standard 9 to 5, that can be quite an attractive prospect for people. So as a result, we were finding that there were gaps starting to appear at the mid to senior level in gameplay programmers, as well as some of the other digital games roles. And then as an example for the purpose-built studios, 1.48 for the national capacity ranking, which means there's low availability, leaning a little bit closer to moderate availability. One thing consistently we heard that Australia's studios are really highly regarded in terms of the quality of the facilities, the technical capabilities, that they work very well for both domestic and international productions of all sizes. Where the challenges come in is around access constraints. So larger international productions often have quite significant footprints. They'll use a lot of the stages, they'll use a lot of the parking, the production offices, and that can really limit access for smaller productions or domestic productions, as well as shorter term bookings, or perhaps productions that just need some production offices to complement their location shooting. And that becomes really difficult to navigate around when not only when those large productions are in, but when you roughly have one or two studios in most states, it doesn't leave a lot of options for those other productions. However, complicating this is that there is quite inconsistent usage in terms of purpose-built studios. And this isn't an Australian specific finding. This is something we've seen globally. But you will have a studio that can be booked out for 6 months up to a year, and then it will remain empty for a few months. And it will have a very sort of cyclical pattern like that. But that does complicate efforts to expand or redevelop if you're not sure that there's going to be that through line of production that's needed. And then just in terms of some common challenges that underpinned some of the capacity constraints we were seeing, I won't go into all of these, but they are all in our report in each of the three sectors, and we do have a lot of more detail for each of them. But just to go into a couple, and again, these are not necessarily Australia only challenges that we've encountered. Some of them are quite unique to the screen sector, but we've seen them elsewhere that we've worked. For instance, the education industry disconnect. So often we found this in Australia, particularly in the more technical roles in VFX or animation or digital games, but graduates that are out of steps with the skills needed for those entry-level roles, which can mean it's harder to find that first job outside of university or the training course. And it may mean doing additional training in order to fill those gaps. We also heard increasingly a lot about the work-life balance and burnout. The screen sector is one marked by long hours, tight schedules getting tighter as well, and for most, very physically demanding work. And that all contributes to this imbalance that people have. And that puts a lot of pressure, particularly on keeping people and retaining them in the sector throughout their career. And then lastly, one thing that came up, particularly again in those technical roles in VFX, animation, digital games, was around the impact of AI. And this is still very much a moving target. It's hard to know what that impact is going to be, how it will be implemented. But what we did find was that a lot of people had a lot of concern or anxiety about the longevity of their career. Will their roles still exist in 5, 10, 15 years? And what skill set do they need to be able to stay in the sector? Is AI going to have an impact on that? And if it is, what do they need to do in order to maintain that, that skill set that's required for their career? And then one thing that we did at the very end was a separate report of recommendations. These were designed to provide a really practical roadmap for developing a resilient, a skilled, and a scalable workforce, as well as an ecosystem that supports the sector. And these have been designed to be driven by industry, education providers, and government, that it's very much a collaborative effort that's required to get to fill these gaps, but also to make sure that there's no duplication of effort. There's hugely successful work happening at the national and also the state and territory level in Australia. So better supporting those relationships across these different groups so that they can continue to grow and support the sector. I don't have the recommendations on screen, but these are the 4 areas and thematic areas that we supported these recommendations through. So looking at business sustainability and scaling, career progression and seniority gaps, overarching training strategy and training program optimization, and then infrastructure constraints as the final area. So that was a quick tour through both the PICA study and some of our findings from the Screen Australia PICA. I'm now going to be joined by Grainne Brunsdon, who is the Chief Operating Officer at Screen Australia. We'll have a discussion about the report in a bit more detail, and then we will open it up for questions. So please do add those questions into the chat as they come up, and we will get to them as soon as we can. So Grainne, hello, thank you for joining me today.
You're welcome. Thank you.
So I think first, what would be great to hear from you is just what motivated Screen Australia to do this study at this point in time?
I think anecdotally, we were aware of a lot of the things that the report surfaced. And talking with state and territory colleagues, as we do on a really regular basis, there was a real desire for some more research to properly dig in and understand what we thought we were seeing, and to see actually, was it the same across the country? As you know, Australia is a very big country. States and territories have their own individual screen agencies and have their own individual needs, their own sectors and strengths and opportunities in each one as well. And some are at different levels of maturity in the screen sector. So there was a real opportunity, I think, to do a national study, but also then have a state-by-state breakdown so that we could get a bit more granular, not just with the roles, but also to better understand what WA might need as opposed to what Queensland might need. And then given that the location offset at 30% had been confirmed in the prior year, we also wanted to understand if we were going to be expecting an increased pipeline of international work coming in and using those studio facilities. Did we have the right studio facilities in place? If not, what perhaps might we need over coming years? And did we have the crew to fill them and to service those productions coming in? Because ideally, if we're getting international productions in, we want to be able to service them with local crew, and not have people bringing crew from international locations as much as possible. So that was kind of where the motivation came from. We had done Ellsberg had done the one in 2021 that just kind of gave us a bit of a lay of the land at that time. But given it was COVID, things had changed, and obviously the world's changed since 2021. We really wanted to get an up-to-date assessment of where we could focus our efforts. The location offset also has a training requirement as part of that. So if you're receiving the location offset from the federal government, there is a training spend requirement, and where that might need to be focused in the different states that those productions might turn up to.
And were any of the findings or the insights from the report surprising, or did they typically align with what you anecdotally had expected to find?
Largely, yes. And I think, and certainly in terms of the roles that were hardest to recruit, because we were hearing that just through domestic production as well, not, obviously not for international. It's just kind of it's one workforce really that kind of moves between both, and we were certainly seeing it at a local level, a domestic level, and then hearing those reports at an international level as well. But it was and in a way, it was good to know that there were no real big surprises there, that we weren't kind of missing anything. But to get the analysis underneath it was super helpful. And because each of the states is also looking at what they can do in their particular state or territory to support crew, to support training, to support the development of the sector in that state, I think it's also helpful for them if they're looking for perhaps funding from their state, if they're looking at training organisations, how they might focus the efforts of a training institution to work closer with industry around those outcomes. Having that kind of independent research and evidence is very helpful for that.
Excellent. And I mean, what is next with this, with the findings that you've got, and how is it being used by Screen Australia or other stakeholders in Australia?
So all the state and territory agencies, I noticed there are a few on the in the audience tonight for this. They're all talking together about what they might do, as are with the training institutions. So with NIDA and AFTRS, who are the two national training institutions, everybody's read it, everybody's digested it, and now it's looking at, okay, now what? How do we work together to make the most of limited budgets, and how do we, if Western Australia is looking to develop, let's say, line producers, how could Northern Territory benefit from that too? Or can we do something that we then scale up rather than having to duplicate and build something from scratch in a different state? Some states, are focusing in on what they're also kind of seeing locally. So Screen New South Wales, for example, has got their new crew, what do they call it? Their crew development program that they launched this year, which looks at some specific roles. And actually, when I was reading through your recommendations again today about having the working with education, having a placement, but having mentorship as well, it models exactly that. That process. So there is training, formal training at no cost. There's attachments at 20 weeks, so a kind of a good amount of time, and mentorships for 2 years for those particular roles. So it's been, I think, very helpful to have that come out through the research to help with that kind of modelling.
Excellent. I suppose if you were advising anyone else, I mean, what was it about this type of approach in the study that was most valuable and most important for you in terms of doing this study?
I think for us, it was getting that national approach, because each state generally looks after its own patch. And while there is collaboration between the states, all the state agencies talk together a lot, but everybody gets focused on their own area and what they need to do in their own state. I think this gave us that national overview and the opportunity to say, okay, we really need these roles. You really need these roles. Let's do this together, so that people are sharing costs, sharing resources, and or working with organizations like NIDA and AFTRS, who are also saying, how can we help? How can we do not just our formal education courses, but how can we do some either micro-credentialing or short industry-focused courses that are going to be, and what's of use to you, that we can build something and bring it out to you. So I think it's helped everybody come to the same starting point. I think it's also, from a Screen Australia point of view, we did a couple of years of below the line training. That's not something that we're involved in anymore, other than requiring productions who have got direct funding for their productions to put on attachments, paid attachments. But we are focused on how can we equip producers and practitioners with the knowledge and insights, both of the market, but also business practice, also for working with private investors, also for stakeholder management, so that they can make better informed decisions, having this insight from across multiple projects rather than from just from their one project that they're kind of getting up on an intermittent basis. So there's a real kind of crossover, and that obviously came up in terms of that scaling, that business efficiency, that business knowledge and market insight as being something that was also really important. So we're looking at that. We've also put in a submission through the new National Cultural Policy consultation process that's underway at the moment, seeking support for a program for essentially screen scale program, which is about business development for screen and games companies as well, because we recognize there's a real need for that. We ran an enterprise program for a number of years, very successful, also for individuals to get those placements, either domestically or internationally, which again can be life-changing and certainly career-changing for people. And people have had some extraordinary experiences from it and learned so much. We'd love to be able to institute that, but at scale. We're working with Screen Queensland and Indigenous Business Australia on a specific business development program for First Nations led production companies, which I think will be really special, being delivered by No Coincidence Media up in Queensland. So there are there's certainly the sector is telling us that's what they need as well. And certainly in the games sector, we're seeing that too. There's a real boom in indie game studios in Australia. Some of that is from layoffs from the big studios. And those people have kind of moved into building their own, set up their own studio and their own games. But there is a need for business practices, and how can people move really from their kitchen table to a boardroom and build that kind of business so that they can be successful in that space as well. It's a fantastic cultural export for Australia. We've got our screen currency research coming out at the end of the month that shows us that 95% of revenues for the games sector in Australia is from international sources. So it really is a huge kind of driver of export, and we'd like them to be feel like they're equipped to take on those challenges and the opportunities.
Excellent. Thank you, Grainne. We're going to open up for questions. So we have the first question that's come through is just in terms of the one finding that stood out was that domestic TV series and independent features struggle to access studio space while larger studios are booked in advance. What role do we see smaller open access studios playing in addressing this gap? So, I mean, I'll start, Grainne, and then maybe you'll have stuff that you would like to add in. I think one of the things that came up in this study, as well as other studies we've done like this, is being able to have those options and having a range of sizes available. Because obviously one of the other challenges, if you're a smaller studio as production or you have smaller needs in terms of what that studio space is, a bigger studio, it may just be outsized for what you need or what you want. So having that range of options, smaller stages, smaller facilities that have a higher proportion perhaps of production offices. So if people are shooting on location and just need some production offices to support their work, I think it's really about balancing all of those options so that people have choice, and that if you have a huge superhero film or a Star Wars film or something like that shooting, that there is opportunities for people to still continue with their productions, not have to stop portions of production waiting for that space to open up. Grainne, anything on that from you?
I completely agree. I mean, I think, certainly something that we've seen in Australia is that people will have a pencil booking for a smaller space on a big studio lot, but as soon as a big film comes in and wants to take everything, that pencil booking gets scrubbed. So it is difficult. You're quite right, Christopher, with that question about that kind of those smaller productions struggling to find the space. So I think it is really important that those smaller studio spaces, and as Kayleigh said, production office space exist and are available for people. Because they can be booked, they can be used, and they're incredibly important. We've seen recently with the Perth studios that have opened recently, I know that they've got production in there, but they also have some local productions that are just using the production office space in order to kind of get their work going. So that kind of mixed use space is also really important and I think vital for a local industry.
Excellent. Another question that came through was whether there are any particular regions that came out of the study where capacity pressures are greatest. Again, I'll go first, Grainne, and then jump in with anything else. So one thing I think that came up for us is just around the sort of brain drain that you have from more emerging markets within Australia or regional locations where they may have some production, but they don't necessarily have that consistent through line. So if you're starting in that sector, you might work on one or two productions, but then it dries up. And if you want to stay working in that role or in that sector, a lot of people then get attracted to the hubs on the East Coast where there's that more consistent work. But then that obviously gives you the catch-22, because how do you build more production regionally or in a different city or elsewhere in Australia if you don't have the crew base or the equipment to support it? And that's something we've seen. I think it takes time to grow and develop that. But I know that, like, and Grainne, you'll have even more information about this, but a lot of the state agencies, state and territory agencies, doing really good work to attract production into their states, to support domestic productions to be made in their state or their location so that there is that consistent work flow so that people, if they want to be a line producer in Perth, they can stay in Perth. They don't have to move where the production is. But that I think is one of the it's not necessarily a particular region, it's more the difference between those central hubs and the more emerging or more remote locations.
I think that's right. I mean, I think it's something Queensland's done really well over the last 10 years or so. It was very much a location for international production. There wasn't a lot of domestic production, but they've been slowly building that over the last number of years, and they're now really growing that in terms of the domestic sector there, which is fantastic. Western excuse me, Western Australia is also very active in this space too. That has been used a lot as a location for domestic production because of the locations that it offers, and they have attractive incentives as well to lure people over. But they've also been very cognizant that people have had to bring crew over as well, and at a lot of expense in order to service those productions. But they again have been slowly building their crew and been strategic about which roles they want to build, supporting their local production companies in order that once they got their studio facilities ready, once they had more of a crew base, that they could then support local productions. So the state agencies are very clear about what they're trying to do and know their sectors intimately and are very focused on specific roles and specific areas.
Thanks, Grainne. Good time for a couple more. So the first from Lou. The report suggests the biggest gap isn't getting people into the industry, it's helping them progress. And do we see funding evolving to support that? So just in terms of that result, I mean, that is, I think, a consequence of what we were seeing in the pre-pandemic boom, where a lot of training and funding was going towards that entry level. How do we get people into the sector? And now, definitely, one of the key findings that came across all three of the sectors we looked at was about how do people make that progression, whether it's into the mid-levels or into those senior roles, and get the support they need, the training they need, but also sometimes some clarity about what that progression pathway actually looks like. I mean, Grainne, in your perspective, do you see funding evolving around this?
Well, I think it's already there. And certainly that kind of that Screen New South Wales initiative that I spoke about, that's for entry and mid-level. So there absolutely is a recognition that there needs to be support for those mid-level, not just entry level, and supporting people to move from being in the industry for a couple of years and moving into a more senior role, and having the support to be able to do that, especially with that mentorship over a couple of years. I think that's something that's recognised across the industry. So I think state agencies would be very aware of that. It's certainly something the training institutions are aware of as well, NIDA and AFTRS, about supporting people in that area. And MIA, which is the kind of the crew union, really that's something they're very aware of too. I think one of the issues has been burnout. And kind of mental health, certainly post-COVID, we're seeing that a lot. I mean, in many areas of the economy, not just the screen sector, of course. And Screenwell, with their mental health action plan, have done some great work around this. We supported some research around alternative production methodologies that was run by our Gender Matters Task Force, which again was really interesting, modelling what it might look like for a 9-day fortnight or an 8-hour day, or different kind of ways of working that would perhaps preserve people's work-life balance a bit more. So I think it's also a generational thing. I think we've got a generation coming into the workforce more generally who will want a different way of working. So I think it will be forced if it's not adopted earlier by the sector itself. And I don't think that's a bad thing. Yeah.
Excellent. And I think we've got time for one last one, which is a bit of a big question. But what emerging trends do we think will have the biggest impact on production capacity? So I think from my perspective, one of the biggest question marks, and I mentioned it in the presentation, is just around AI, and just what that means in terms of changes to workflow, changes to roles, and things like that. Um, Grainne, anything in particular that you think could have a big impact on capacity?
I think, well, taking a step back, not just on capacity, but I think on the sector more generally,
Mm.
it's where are audiences and people
Yeah.
being more audience focused. I think the old models are not as they were, and they're changing rapidly. I mean, we've probably seen more change in the last 5 years than in the previous 30, 40 years. So I think there is, that we've seen that contraction in terms of commissions, notwithstanding the content obligations that have been put on the streamers in Australia since January this year. And we're seeing an uptick in the number of feature films. And certainly over the last 10 years, there's probably been a 50% increase, both in Australian and international feature films being released on screens in Australia. Same number of screens, so it's very hard to actually find space to give them all room to breathe and be seen by audiences. But traditional TV audiences, traditional streaming audiences, YouTube is the biggest platform in the world currently. Australia is no different, and people actually making work for where audiences are now, I think that's going to be a really big change, because it's not going to look like it does currently in the next 5 years, I would suggest. That suggests a different production methodology. It suggests different skill sets, or certainly evolved skill sets, and a different way of working and a different way of developing and producing work for an audience that's in a different platform.
Thanks, Grainne. I think one final thing I will add to that, which I think links to that, that came up in the Screen Australia study, was the loss of neighbours. And that kind of doesn't necessarily have to be a soap, but often they are phenomenal training grounds for people. Large number of episodes, consistent work year after year. The other thing we heard was around children's programming also being really great ways for people to learn the ropes of the screen sector, understand how to work in a fast-paced environment, and then take those skills into other high-end television, into feature film, wherever it is they may want to work. And I think losing neighbours, and we've seen this in other countries as well, we're seeing a shorter number of episodes typically in a series, just makes it a little bit different. And I think we'll need to rethink how people build those skills if they're working to 10 episodes
Yeah.
versus 30.
But I think there's a shift as well, because
Yeah.
you've also then got, in the direct to audience space as well, that can also be a really good training ground, and it's often a place where people go if they can't get a commission, don't want to work in want to be in control of their own destiny and do that work. And we've seen with Obsession and Backrooms and Talk to Me, the success that people can have in terms of build, and the Amazing Digital Circus, a great Western Sydney company, Glitch, that only put the stuff into the cinema because their fans wanted them to. So it's that, again, that connection to audience, and how can you create that relationship, create that community, and build work in an iterative way. So I think, while I'd love to see another long-running series, because you're right, it's a great training ground, not just for crew, but also for writers, for new directors, and for production skills more generally. And it's a great economic booster as well for wherever it's going to be filmed and produced. But there are, I think, alternatives to that in the direct-to-audience space. We're doing things like our Kids IP Incubator, trying to help, traditional kids content producers understand what a direct-to-audience model might look like, both in terms of the production methodology, but also in the business models, because it's a very different type of business model, where you might be combining live events and merchandise, not just, trying to get subscriptions. And certainly in the kids space, that's a much harder thing to do, but it's more of a flywheel of IP than an episode or a series of episodes.
Excellent. Well, on that note, Grainne, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this webinar. If you have any other questions, please do reach out over email. Happy to answer them. And the report is available on our website if you want to deep dive into any of the findings. to understand more about what we found and also what our recommendations for Screen Australia, as well as the rest of the industry stakeholders in Australia, were. So thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you in the future.
Thanks, Kayleigh.